Hello, I'm Glenn Gallagher with California Air Resources Board. California Air Resources Board is the agency that is responsible for reducing greenhouse gas emissions in California. And Senate Bill 32 says we have to reduce all GHG emissions 40% by 2030. And Senate Bill 1383 that was just passed in October 2016 says we have to reduce hydrofluorocarbon emissions 40% by 2030. And that is beyond and below 2013 levels, which means it's actually a 60% reduction below business as usual. So that's basically what I work on. I'm going to start working on actual regulations on how we're going to comply with this law of 40%. So on the future of refrigerants, great topic. I've been thinking about this a lot. I've been working on this off and on since 1992, I think. Everybody agrees, US EPA SNAP program, the European Union, the Kigali Amendment, that's the global HFC phase down, and ARB, we agree that refrigerants will be low GWP, but one of the questions we have is, do we mean very low GWP, global warming potential, or just sort of? I think Steve already answered a lot of that. When will this happen, and will the refrigerants be natural, CO2, hydrocarbons, ammonia, water and air, or will they be synthetic, which I mean hydrofluorocarbons and the latest hydrofluoroolefins or unsaturated HFCs? Well, here we've got, as a little bit of background, these are F-gas emissions in general. And you see the total is going down because the ODS, CFCs and HCFCs, are pretty much going to reach zero by 2030 almost. But of course, as you can't use R22 and the freons anymore, the hydrofluorocarbons went up. This actually is without the Kigali Amendment. So that's kind of what concerns us, is that increasing HFC line. We are interested in reducing all HFCs. Most of them, almost all of them, come from refrigerants, at least 86%. The rest are aerosol propellants, insulating foam, solvents, and fire suppressants. So we've decided to concentrate on refrigerants. And this is the same pie chart, except we're looking at the refrigerants have been broken down now into, on the upper right, commercial refrigeration. That's about 42% of all HFC emissions from what we can estimate. Commercial air conditioning, 14%, not a small part. Residential refrigeration, that's your refrigerator freezer, 1%, not a big deal. Residential AC, 10%, huge. Mobile air conditioning and transport, it used to be about actually 33%. It's being reduced more and more because the air conditioning in new cars starting model year 2021 are all going to use HFOs. HFO 1234YF with a GWP of about 1. So that's going to shrink down to almost zero by 2040, at least for light-duty vehicles. And of course, you still have propellants, insulating foam, solvents, and fire suppressants. And this is Steve's version of this is so much better. This is the Kigali phase-down schedule. Basically, developing countries, that's the US. And you see developed countries, that's the US. And developing, it basically is broken down into all the countries except for the really hot ones. But Steve, I love your slide. Okay, there's going to be an HFC global phase down, so why is California doing anything? Well, we're not going to reach our reduction goals by 2030. We have to reach 40% less than 2013 levels by 2030. The global phase down won't get us there. The reason why is because there's a lag time on the installed base of equipment, right? You've got R22 equipment that was built before 2010 is still being used. It's leaking refrigerants. Same thing with the HFCs. Whatever refrigerant goes in will probably used for the lifetime of it is going to continue to emit. So we're going to need additional HFC reductions. Here is a graph showing, this is kind of business as usual without the Kigali phase-down amendment. These are the HFCs keep going up and up and up. This is where we're trying to get to. So with the phase down schedule, this is production and consumption of HFCs. But what happens is, just because you're not selling it anymore doesn't mean it's not being emitted. So what I did was, I estimated the actual emissions reductions here, and you can see these are the emissions, and they do kind of lag behind the production and consumption. From the California point of view, and probably should be the national point of view as well, that's about 10 years too late to get significant reductions, and that's why we're working on our own reduction measures. Our plan is to prohibit refrigerants with a global warming potential of 150 or greater in new stationary refrigeration equipment. Our goal date right now is to start that 2022. At the same time, there will be a sales restriction on refrigerants with a global warming potential greater than 2,500, and this is really just 404A and 507, followed about 4 years later by any refrigerant with a GWP of greater than 1,500, which eliminates quite a few, including 410A, one of the favorite AC refrigerants. There will be some exemptions. Here we're still on stationary refrigeration. Anything that contains less than 50 pounds, we're thinking of an exemption, and that is essentially every restaurant, school, convenience store. And for very low temperature, we really haven't found too many low GWP refrigerants that work great. Part of the restriction, the big exemption there is recycled, reclaimed is always a good idea. So essentially, I think I'll go back one. This looks like the regulation is actually favoring natural refrigerants or pure HFOs. It kind of is, although we're quite neutral. If you have a pure HFO that works, it's fine with us. Stationary air conditioning, okay. More of interest to this audience. We've proposed just really copying the European Union F-gas regulation, that any refrigerant with a GWP greater than 750 would be banned in new equipment. We've proposed a 2024 start date. That date is flexible, and the reason why, and Steve did a great job of explaining, the codes and standards really don't allow the slightly flammable refrigerants. This would allow R32, and it would allow almost all of the HFO, HFC blends that Steve talked about. So they're very slightly flammable, functionally not allowed right now except in very small charge sizes. The updated codes, we are on those committees. We're trying to get those changed to allow greater charge sizes if safe. Okay, what is Air Resources Board doing? Well, we're looking into a low GWP feasibility of a convenience store size refrigeration. Right now, really only Japan has really good low GWP for convenience store sizes. Let's say you've got a remote condensing unit, about 30, 40 pounds refrigerant. Ideally, transcritical CO2 or pure HFOs would be great because they're low GWP. We haven't really seen the cost effectiveness yet because they cost a lot more. We're planning on giving an official notice of rulemaking this summer after talking about it for about 8 years. We'll have lots of workshops and public input, and we hope to have some board approval on the commercial, it'll be commercial stationary refrigeration. We're holding off on stationary AC until the codes and standards are updated. We feel it's not quite ready for us to put that in a rule. And if I have a little bit more time, we get some good questions from stakeholders. Here's one that was actually kind of brought up. If the refrigerant doesn't leak and is managed, what's the problem? Well, as everyone in the room knows, leaks do happen, and they really aren't preventable. We just think it's better to use the right refrigerant at the start. Why a GWP limit? Why not a total performance standard for like total equivalent warming impact or the life cycle? This is a really good idea, and I think we're really open to this. We just don't know where to start. Every facility is different. And where do you set the baseline? We're not quite sure how to enforce it. That doesn't mean we're not considering this. It has a lot of appeal. Why not just let the global HFC phase down work? probably take too long. Are HFOs environmentally friendly? Treading on dangerous water here. The US EPA says they are. ARB does not have a separate refrigerant acceptance program. We accept whatever the US EPA says is safe and environmentally friendly. However, we know that when HFOs, hydrofluoroolefins, get in the air, they break down. One of the breakdown products is trifluoroacetic acid, which is a toxin to aquatic life. There's really no problems at this point. I guess one of the issues is it really doesn't break down. We're asked this question a lot. Aren't the HFOs the next latest, greatest synthetic refrigerant? Aren't they just going to be phased out like CFCs were, HCFCs, and now HFCs? Well, the answer is actually probably yes, if the TFA, trifluoroacetic acid, concentrations ever build up to toxic levels. It probably wouldn't happen for a long time, many decades. So are there any refrigerants that are actually regulation proof? Remember, ammonia is toxic. CO2 is okay, but technically CO2 is a greenhouse gas. Hydrocarbons are flammable. HFCs are high GWP. HFOs, there's still some questions about them. I think if you look far enough ahead in the future, you're just left with water, vapor, air, and magnetic refrigeration. Thank you.
All right, we have a couple minutes so we can take some questions for the speakers if we have any. Other than Glenn's, by the way. Oh, you gonna go around?
Yeah. Who's there? Hi, Antash Najib. I'm a GSR at WCC. I had a question based on Steve's presentation that there are more options available in terms of using a flammable refrigerant in certain applications. So would it be possible for lawmakers and those who are making these regulations to target those applications more? That's a question from you. Yeah, based on Steve's presentation, but a question.
Okay, the short answer is yes. I think we should target stationary air conditioning with, it looks like the A2L refrigerants are the ones that are being favored by industry. I know Daikin has spent a lot of money to prove that they're safe, and along with the refrigerant companies have spent billions. Does it warrant a closer look in terms of safety and feasibility and energy efficiency? Absolutely yes. Our plan was to require new lower GWP equipment for stationary AC by 2024. Originally it was 2020. Everyone said you're crazy, and we agreed. Now it's 2024. We hope that the industry will actually start moving that way before we have to have extra regulations for just California, because we really prefer national and global regulations. They work so much better.
Are there any other questions? I guess I have a question for you. How much effort do you guys think there's going to be towards developing a product that uses a hydrocarbon refrigerant, like an air conditioning product or a standalone refrigerant product? And what are we going to do about regulations for such products?
Hydrocarbon. Well, hydrocarbons are great refrigerants. You only put fluorines on them or chlorines on them to inhibit the flammability and hurt their performance a little bit. It's all going to come down to what you can do with the charge size that you have. So from a direct expansion standpoint, when you put the refrigerant in the room, there's going to be a limit. Designing equipment is pretty straightforward. They look just like HFC equipment. If you saw a hydrocarbon piece of equipment without the safeties on it and a regular HFC system, they look the same. You have a compressor, it looks like a scroll or a recip. They all look the same. Same coils, all that stuff. It's just the safety requirements. Now, larger charge for hydrocarbons, you could go outside and be air-cooled water chillers But then if you have an alternative that's a lot safer in those applications, you would end up doing that anyway. So safety still drives it around the hydrocarbons.
Yeah, I think technology for hydrocarbons already there. And when I was young, I involved in develop propane split system, and that runs in some factory in Asahi Beer, and it's run more than 15 years. But you really need to install some extra safety countermeasures, some alarms, some ventilation systems. It's really independent from your air conditioning system. So, is it viable commercial product? I would say no. It's very, but because they have a different purpose, they're asking us to develop for that. But as a regular, ordinary product, it's too expensive.
One more question. How much of the refrigerant research that you guys do is focused on a drop-in replacement for 410? Because you notice the R22 equipment still on the rooftops because you can't just drop in a new refrigerant, or there's very few options for that. So how much of the focus is on replacement, drop-in replacement for either R22 or R410 equipment versus a completely different refrigerant that could be used in a new piece of equipment?
Yeah, I think that's a hard question to answer. I mean, ideally for the industry, if you want to move quickly and meet regulatory requirements quick, design compatible is what you want. Now, there are replacements for R22. They're like 407C and a whole pile of these other ones people are designing around it to drop in, and you got to do a few changes, and you always have some impacts. But I would say we, at Train, Ingersoll Rand, we spend 50% of our time on either side of the fence. Because if we have to get to the goal of a lower GWP, we will compromise capacity and design center lines to get to the target. And the industry has done that, right? I mean, the industry already moved from R22 to 410A, higher pressure, right? So the industry will adapt and move to whatever needs to meet the regulatory requirements.
I would say R22 is more US problem. We don't have that kind of problem in Asia.
Maybe along the same lines, but a little different. CARB is very, very intrigued by low-charge ammonia for comfort cooling, not for residential, but probably office buildings. We think it has a lot of promise.
I could comment on that ammonia thing if you want. Ammonia is a very efficient refrigerant. Problem is you can't take advantage of it in certain applications. So when you look at a lot of the HFC's equipment, you can do multi-stage, direct drive with the motors and stuff. You don't get the high compressor discharge temperature. You can throw copper at it. Copper is much more efficient. You can drive the approach temperatures down. So it really has nothing to do with the refrigerant as long as you have the hardware you can take advantage of it with and the technology. Now people are introducing ammonia products into comfort cooling, and they are going around 90.1. And they're not certified to HRI, and we know they don't meet the requirements. Not that I'm against ammonia, I just want to make sure that, people introduce all kinds of new refrigerants, but they have to meet certain standards of minimum efficiency, which I know Dick and you would agree is the #1 greenhouse gas is around efficiency. The refrigerants are secondary. We're meeting those requirements, but we need to drive the efficiency home and allow the industry to grow the efficiency as well. So,
Let's thank our panel. Oh, got one more. Paul. You have the microphone.
This is Hua from Montes. Very fortunately, we have a pretty big companies here, manufacturer. I want to ask a question from another point of view. What's your take about this future trend for this regulation on the refrigerant? And for example, Daikin and also Train, you make your own compressor chiller by yourself. But for majority of this HVAC industry, like Montes, the small manufacturer, actually we just follow Okay, so my question is, will this trend facilitate the more consolidation for the compressor type technology to facilitate the more kind of a concentration of only several manufacturers can make the compressor and all the others follow that or buy that? Or will this trend facilitate a more diversified technology? So it's more from the purchasing, sourcing perspective, particularly from the medium, small manufacturer perspective, because we have to buy the compressor anyway from someone. So what is this trend for? Is a less and less number of manufacturer of compressor technology, or is a little bit more? What was your take? Sorry.
Yeah, sure. I can take that. Even the large companies do make buy, right? We don't make everything. And we're part of that distribution channel, so we buy a lot of stuff. In fact, in a lot of companies within Ingersoll Rand, we are at the mercy of what the market has available in the stock, and they assemble things. You ask a very intriguing question, because I've never thought of that. Would there be a consolidation of suppliers in this transition? I would argue probably, now that I've thought about it for 30 seconds, I would argue that we'll probably end up with about the same amount, because there's going to be ability to innovate. Maybe not on the packaging side, but there'll be people with new technology that come in that package things differently. Potentially you have different applications. There might be just as many suppliers as there's tomorrow, because in the last 20 years we have seen the growth of other suppliers from India and China, right? Even on refrigerants, on components, and so we have this diverse base. I expect that diverse space to stay. I mean, there's already consolidation occurring regardless of this happening,
For unitary split system, for small capacity system, I don't know. There are many candidates. I believe R32 is really a good solution for that, and all Japanese manufacturers now go with R32. And if you go to the trade show in China, even Emerson displayed R32 compressor. They are ready to supply Chinese manufacturer after the regulation done. So, and you think the R32 compressor is really a big deal. Not. It's just 410A compressor. Exact the same compressor.
Right behind you, Drew. Click the switch on front. Yeah, to the side.
Yeah. So a lot of times we have what we call unintended consequences. So when we went through the ODP, there was unintended consequences. So have you thought of any that could happen with this new movement?
Unintended consequences? I mean, Glenn brought up TFA. It only occurs with certain molecules, doesn't occur with them all. YF is a classic one. ZE does not make TFA. 1233ZD does not make TFA. By the way, TFA is naturally occurring in the ocean. It rains in San Francisco, you have TFA in the rain, not related to HFCs. So, I mean, it's a complicated issue. We've been racking our brain looking for secondary issues that might be around the HFOs. We haven't seen it. Science hasn't said there is something else. They've been studying this in quite detail. These break down quite to the low levels and are reincorporated into the biosphere. So, I mean, one of the unintended consequences is regulation is driving innovation in the industry, which is a good thing, right? I mean, it's driving new products. It's, I guess, unintended, but good, right? Innovation's a good thing in the marketplace. It drives choice for people. It drives research here. It drives different ways of, looking at buildings. And so the refrigerant innovation, I think, started 20 years ago, caused the industry, 25 years ago, caused the industry to reinvent themselves. And I think this constant reinvention, even though some people say it's bad, I look at it as good opportunity to keep thinking about the Full Employment Act for engineers and chemistry, right?
One thing we get asked a lot, this could be an unintended consequence, is if California and eventually US EPA requires low global warming potential refrigerants, won't you just increase the amount of energy that's used and therefore, increase your total greenhouse gas emissions from indirect emissions. We're all about reducing greenhouse gases, but we don't have much to say about energy efficiency. And the reason why is because we know that the people making and designing and selling the equipment and the refrigerants, they're not going to sell something that's going to drain your wallet, you know, paying electrical bills. It could be an unintended consequence. For example, if you go to transcritical CO2 in Death Valley, you might end up using more energy, but the technology is moving so quickly that what was true 2 years ago, like Steve said, is really no longer true. And we think in another 3 or 4 or 5 years, all of the replacement refrigerants and technology will save energy compared to baseline. So we have thought about that one a lot.